Thank you, Alex. And so to the main event of the morning. I'm joined now by the leader of the Conservative Party, David Cameron. Welcome, Mr. Cameron, and you have given us some rousing words to start with. You say in the Telegraph today that you favour straight talk and radical new leadership. So with straight talk ringing in our ears, let me ask you about Europe. It is now overwhelmingly likely that by the time you come to power, if you do, in the spring, the Lisbon Treaty will have been ratified. That's what the polls are saying, that's what the Czechs are saying after the Irish result. So, what are you going to do then?
Well, we want to have a referendum. I mean, I think people in this country will be frustrated and angry that Ireland has been able to vote twice on a treaty that changes the way we're governed, and yet we haven't been able to vote once. So I want us to hold that referendum, and that's why we've said that as long as this treaty is being debated or discussed anywhere in Europe, we will keep that pledge to hold that referendum, and if those are the circumstances that are there at the next election, we'll name the date, we'll hold that referendum, we'll lead the campaign for a no campaign.
Even if it's been formally ratified, if it's being discussed, as I'm sure it will be in this country at that stage, you will hold a referendum.
What we're saying is that at the moment, yes, of course, the Irish have now voted yes at the second time of asking, but the Czechs have not yet ratified the treaty, the Poles have not yet ratified the treaty, and as long as this treaty hasn't been ratified everywhere in Europe, then we will pledge to hold that referendum.
But as you know, you're not answering the obvious and direct and likely question, which is, once it's ratified, what then? And I put it to you that you're not answering it because you don't know what to do.
No, there's a very good reason for saying what we're saying, which is that I don't want to say anything or do anything now that would undermine or prejudice what is happening in other countries where they're still debating whether to ratify this treaty. That is a very sensible thing to do. And so
if you said, actually, do you know what? Whatever happens, I'm going to give the British people the right to decide. Perhaps like Boris Johnson suggests, there will be a question about actually leaving Europe on the ballot paper as well. Before we get to Tony Blair as president and all the rest of it, I promise, whatever happens, the British people are going to have a right to decide. That would make early ratification less likely. So it would play into what you say you want. So why won't you say it?
Well, because we have the right answer, which is to say, at the danger of repeating myself, that as long as this hasn't been ratified by everyone around Europe, it is then possible to have that referendum. We'd hold that referendum. And the reason for not speculating now about the future is, as I say, I don't want to undermine or prejudice those people elsewhere in Europe who are currently debating.
I don't understand this.
Well, I don't see what's so complicated. I mean, it hasn't been ratified. There were 3 countries it hadn't been ratified in: Ireland, the Czech Republic and Poland. There are now 2. So I don't see any reason to change our approach because one of those has now decided to ratify.
The Czechs are now suggesting that it will be ratified by Christmas.
Well, the Czech Prime Minister talked about 3 to 6 months, and obviously if it's 6 months, that takes you pretty much up to the general election in this country, and we'll be able to have that referendum. So as I say, this is the right...
But you won't have the referendum if the treaty is ratified.
No, what I've said is that as long as it is being debated or discussed...
This is the most obvious... the likeliest outcome is something that matters hugely to your party. 60-odd% of your party want the chance to repatriate powers and look again at our relationship with Europe. The public are in a fairly similar place at the moment. Your MPs are too. And yet... the likely situation is that you will come to power if you do. Perhaps Tony Blair will be there as President of the European Union, and the treaty will be ratified, and there won't be much you can do.
But Andrew, with respect, this is exactly what people said to me a year ago, a year and a half ago. They said, this treaty is going to be ratified, it's going to be implemented. Actually, we then had the Irish referendum, we have the delay taking place in the Czech Republic, the delay taking place in Poland. I think for that reason it makes sense to say, and we want, be clear, I want to have a referendum. I don't think this is
you're going to have one then.
I don't think this is a good treaty.
If
I think
you want
it is
to have a
centralising
referendum, have a referendum.
Well, I've set out exactly what we're going to do, and if those circumstances change, I'll happily come back on your programme and explain exactly what we'll do.
Well, a lot of people watching will say the reason he can't say that he's going to have a referendum if the Lisbon Treaty is ratified is because it's going to be too disruptive, it's too much of a big issue, it's going to cause too much anger
I think people
parties.
watching will understand this argument that while there are other countries actually delaying the implementation of this treaty, don't do anything or say anything that stops them from doing that. stick to your pledge for the referendum and
But
explain.
as I said before, if you said you were going to have a referendum, that would delay the treaty being ratified. It's certainly not going to speed it up. So why the silence? I just don't understand.
Well, I can set the answer to music if you like, but that is, I think people will understand that you don't want to prejudice or undermine people who currently have said we're going through our own ratification process. I think people at home will also be wondering, well, they're going to ask me questions about anything else.
Well, there's plenty of time for that. I wouldn't worry. Staying with Europe for the time being, however, you've fallen out pretty badly with Angela Merkel's CDU. They've broken off links with you as a party. They don't like the grouping that you're going into at the moment. And there is clearly a fresh drive towards a sort of Franco-German fast-track core of Europe. Are you content with the situation where we are on the sidelines?
Well, I don't agree with your description of what is happening. I have a very good relationship with Angela Merkel. I've met several times, a good relationship with President Sarkozy in France. But it's a relationship based on frank, honest and candid talk about the things where we agree, and there are many areas where we do agree, and also about the areas where we disagree. And the reason I took the Conservatives out of the European People's Party and formed a new group in Europe is I wanted us to actually say the same thing whether we are in Manchester or in London or in Brussels, which is we want to be members of the European Union, but we want it to be an association of states trading and cooperating. We do not want it to become a country called Europe. And that, I think, is for the first time, what is exciting is for the first time in the European Union now, there is actually a group of parties that say, yes, we want to be in this union, but we want to reform it. We want to make sure it's an association of states rather than endless centralisation of power. That is actually standing up for millions of people, not just in Britain, but all across Europe, who take that view. And the argument, and one last point, because I think this is important, and the argument I've always made with Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy is, actually, we will be now friendly neighbours of the EPP. We'll work together where we agree, rather than unhappy tenants. And the first thing we did as this new group, we voted with the EPP to make Mr. Barroso the president, the commissioner again, because we think he's doing a good job. So that's a good example of actually being constructive and having influence in Europe.
Would it be a disaster if this country was friendly neighbours with the EU rather than being a full member of this federal body?
Well, that's not what I want. I want us to be
members of the... Would it be a disaster?
Well, it would not be as good as what we should have, which is what we should have, which is being members of the European Union, but trying to take Europe in the right direction.
If you can't negotiate a slightly looser relationship and repatriate some of those powers, as your party desperately want to do, if they simply say, no, I'm terribly sorry, after all this process, the Lisbon Treaty has been ratified, we can't go back to all of that, terribly sorry. If that's the situation, would you look again at our fundamental relationship with the EU?
Well, I don't believe in going into any situation or any negotiation thinking that you're going to fail. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was told frequently, you'll never get any money back from Europe. That's not the way it works. You just have to give in and take what you're given. I don't accept that. I think that we bring a lot to the European Union.
So what would you like back from Europe?
Well, we've said that we think that the social and employment legislation, we think that's an area that ought to be determined nationally rather than at the European level. There are many things in the Lisbon Treaty, giving more power over home affairs and justice, that we don't think is right. We think Lisbon, the problem with it, is that it's taking powers away from the nation states, centralising them in Europe. We don't think that's the right approach.
We should move on to other things.
But I think what you can see is there's a real clear and consistent line, whether it's which party you should be a member of in Europe, what you're saying about the European Constitution. There's a really clear and consistent line that has come all the way. And when Gordon Brown was,
except that you don't know what to do if the treaty is ratified. You may very well have to swallow President Tony Blair. How would that feel?
Well, bad, because we don't want a president of Europe. I don't think that's the right approach. One last point on this, which is, the Labour government, the Labour Prime Minister promised us a referendum. They have backed out of that promise and let the British people down.
And now you're promising us a referendum, but not really.
A very important point, and not a point that, as far as I can see, was raised with Gordon Brown at all.
But you've offered a referendum. You say, you're giving the rhetoric of a referendum. I want a referendum, but actually, when you look at the detail, you're not offering a referendum.
I couldn't have described it more clearly.
Well, that's, with respect, possibly the problem.